Well, welcome to a new journey. This summer, we're on a journey that is going to be different than what we've been on before. And so I want to, first of all, introduce it by the concept of the cornerstones. Now, cornerstones have a twofold function in construction. Number one, it's a starting point at the corner, but also it provides stability for the structure. Now, the stories in Genesis 1 through 11 are the starting point for the Judeo-Christian culture, as well as providing stability for that Jewish Christian culture for 3,000 years. So we're going to discover the cornerstones of the structure of the Jewish Christian culture. The stories in Genesis 1 through 11 are stories. They are not history. They are prehistoric, told orally from generation to generation, likely around campfires and family settings for thousands of years before they were ever written down by the composer of the first 5 books of the Bible, the composers who started writing these in about 1000 BC. But they had been told orally for hundreds of years. Now, these campfire stories create the cornerstones of the construct of that culture. And we're going to be studying these stories told by the elders, heard by the young. The young grow into elders and they tell them to their young. That's the way the oral tradition works. Now, many of us took the journey last spring in the second most misused and misinterpreted part of the library that we call the Bible. And that's how we decoded the book of Revelation. Well, to sort of tell you what we're into now we are embarking on the first most misused and misinterpreted part of the library we call the Bible, and that's Genesis 1 through 11. And to introduce this week, we are going to consider some of the misuses and misinterpretations of Genesis 1 through 11. Then next week, we will discover the first cornerstone, and in the following 12 weeks, we'll discover a cornerstone every week. So, the misuses and misinterpretations of Genesis 1 through 11 is on our plate. First of all, the greatest misuse and the most notable in our generation is the propaganda of creationism. The idea that the biblical stories of creation are part of human history as if they were written by an eyewitness account is just propaganda. Creationism counters the facts discovered by the scientific community over hundreds of years regarding the age of the earth and the evolution of the created order. Creationism counters that. And it's propaganda, but it's real. When I was a member of the Derby School Board in the 1970s, we had requests and demands were made. They were rejected, but the demands were made to force the biology teachers in Derby High School to teach creationism as an alternate theory, scientific theory of creation. And it's not, and we refused that. But at the same time, in the state of Arkansas, there was a state law proposed to force every school district in Arkansas to teach creationism as an alternative scientific theory of creation. Well, if it hadn't been for Bishop Ken Hicks, a good friend of mine, United Methodist bishop, and interestingly enough, his chancellor, that happened to be Hillary Clinton in Arkansas at the time, if it hadn't been for those two people, that law would have been passed. But their testimony enabled the legislature to, as the Derby School Board, say no. But the propaganda of creationism is the most flagrant misuse and misinterpretation of Genesis 1 through 11. Genesis 1 to 3, about creation, it was a campfire story of one of the several cultures in the Near East. But another notable misuse is the teaching that because these creation stories are in the Hebrew library, the Hebrew Bible, they're universally true. And that's assuming that the Hebrew culture stood alone in 1000 BC when Genesis was first written. But there were other cultures in the Near East which had their own prehistoric stories of creation and human existence. And two of the stories are from the Aramaic Babylonian cultural background, a neighboring culture that became a neighboring empire to the Hebrew nation. But they had their story. The Enuma Elish was the story in the Babylonian storytelling oral tradition, first written 1,000 years before Genesis. So it's not only another story, it's an earlier story. And indeed, the Enuma Elish describes the battle of the gods, which resulted in the triumph of their god, Marduk. He became the superior god who created order out of chaos. And because their god was superior and won the battle of the gods, their culture and later their empire, they considered to be superior. You see, just because it's in the Hebrew culture doesn't make it universally true. It's one of many cultures of the day. And in that same culture, there's the epic of Gilgamesh. And it's a story of this entity, this being who was partly divine. And Gilgamesh was on a quest to discover the secrets of immortality. Aha! Similar to the tree of life in the Garden of Eden that held the secrets of immortality. You see, there are many cultures in the Near East, many stories in the Near East of creation, none of which are historic, but they're trying to grab hold of the meaning of human existence. This misuse is assuming that the only prehistoric stories was the stories in the Hebrew culture and therefore literally true. It's a misuse. It's based on the ignorance. For in fact, Genesis 1 to 3, the creation stories, is one of many, not the only source of prehistoric narratives. Now there's another misuse, and that is the assumption that Genesis 1 to 11 is from a single source. The fact is that Genesis 1 to 11 is composed of three sources. One is known by the letter E because the word for divine in this source was Elohim. Another source is the letter J, because in that source, the word for God was Yahweh. You mean the Hebrew people had two names for God? Yes, there were two traditions. And then you have the third source, the letter P, which is the priestly tradition that included the scribes in the Hebrew community. And biblical study can show the distinctiveness of each source through their terminology and their grammar. And there's discrepancies between these three sources. So much of a discrepancy that there are two different stories of creation within the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And I've got to tell you a personal story. In our neighborhood where I grew up, my mother did not start teaching full-time until I was in the upper elementary. So she was home during the week, and people would knock on the door and they would come with their religious message for our family. And she would always say, I'm just not interested at all, but my husband would probably be interested. So why don't you come back on Saturday? I can remember one Saturday, I was laying on the floor behind the couch listening to what took place. And they were to teach my father about the Bible. Well, my father's background was the Campbellite tradition of the Church of Christ. He knew the Bible kiver to kiver in the language of Scotland. K-I-V-E-R means cover to cover. Dad really knew the Bible. And they were talking about creation. And he said, that's interesting because my Bible, that's not the creation story that I like in the Bible. And they said, what do you mean? What creation story do you like? And then he shared the second creation story in the Bible. And they said, where is that? And he opened up his Bible and read it to them. And the visitors left in tears. You see, even Genesis 1 through 11 is made up of 3 different traditions woven into one, but allowing the 2 creation stories to exist side by side. Why did those who composed Genesis include both creation stories? Because they weren't writing history. Both stories were included in the library because both J and E were part of the Hebrew tradition, one from the northern kingdom, one from the southern kingdom. They both belonged in their library, so both were included. The final misuse and misinterpretation of Genesis 1 through 11 is the result of reading the Bible as literature rather than the Bible being studied. You study the Bible as a source of revealed truth. As literature, the Campfire stories have been understood as history written by an unnamed eyewitness of the time. As a result, church-go curriculum has represented this misinterpretation, and multitudes of people have had to unlearn what they had learned in Sunday school as being literally true, but as they grew, became educated, the proven facts of the evolutionary process of creation has disproven what they were basically taught in Sunday school as history. Therefore, for these people, multitudes, the Bible is suspect, often disregarded, and considered to be irrelevant because stories were taught as history. Now, these misuses and misinterpretations make the case for the next 12 weeks of our journey together, for the careful study of the library, especially the first 11 chapters. We'll consider these campfire stories one at a time and discover the truths which they were intended to establish as cultural cornerstones. I encourage you to get ready for the summer by reading Genesis 1 through 11. Read it as you were hearing stories around the campfire. It's a different reading, and I invite you to that journey. But for discussion this first week, I have 3 questions. The first one is rather obvious. Is the reading of Genesis 1 through 11 as campfire stories damaging or lightening in your own journey of faith? Secondly, when in your life did you first experience the incompatibility of scientific inquiry and the teachings of the church? Finally, what are other illustrations of parts of Scripture being misused and misinterpreted, and as a result, doing harm? Enjoy the trip between now and Sunday, and we'll look forward to discussing these and other issues with you.